Welcome back to the Basketball Academy. We're really excited for who we have on. For those of you who follow the newsletter, we've mentioned Doug Lemov a lot. Coach Doug, from a personal standpoint, I've been lucky enough to give his read to so many coaches that have come to PGC sessions, specifically, teach like a champion one, teach like a champion two, and then also number three coming out, practice perfect, which has been like our coaching Bible. And then my personal favorite, Coach's Guide to Teaching. We're really excited to have you here, Doug. And there's a cool quote that James Clear says in regards to reading. It's something to the extent of like, the good books you read multiple times, the bad ones. I want to make sure I say it correctly here. Yeah, you start more books, quit most of them, and read the great ones twice. Your
Mhm.
book become something of like a doodle where it's like, written and coded over and over again. But we really appreciate you being here, Doug. So thank you for the time.
Well, thanks. I'm really glad to be on with you and appreciate the opportunity.
For sure. James, you want to dive in?
Yeah. Just first question I got for you is recently you spoke with Brett Ledbetter, and we're big What Drives Winning fans as well, and just about retaining information.
Mhm, mhm.
And heard on the pod, Lynn Roberts from University of Utah doesn't speak to her team after games because she understands it's like they're not going to retain anything I say at all.
Mhm.
So I believe that's really awesome to do. And I coach teams out in Portland, and we do that with our teams too. But I think it's really important. You got to train players to be able to handle that. You can't just say, all right, guys, go talk on your own.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
tools and practices or thoughts do you have on that?
yeah. It's interesting. I've actually been thinking a lot about game day coaching because like almost everything I wrote in Coach's Guide to Teaching is about practice. I love practice. Sometimes coaches will say, why don't you come to watch one of my games? And I said, honestly, would rather come see a practice. But I do think game day coaching is really important. I think the first thing is just to be aware of and intentional about what your goal is. I don't have an opinion on whether you should talk to players after a game or not. I think that it's realistic to think they're probably not going to learn much particularly from like the 20-minute debrief. There could be a productive conversation about emotional regulation or sort of like encouraging players to self-reflect. And I want you to, like today we were really successful. I want you on the drive home, think about one thing that you did really well that you can keep doing, something like that. So, I don't know that they're necessarily not productive. I just think it's, game days are so emotional for players,
Mm.
but also for coaches, right? We are not we're not neutral parties to the endeavor. And so, as coaches, we're take pride in our work. We're upset if we're lost. We're proud if we won, and it can often result in our losing track of what drives performance and what drives learning. I think halftime is a particularly useful thing to think about. It's fascinating. I don't think anyone really knows what works at halftime, but I'm pretty sure that telling players 15 things that they're doing wrong and that they should do differently is, likely to overload their working memory, not likely to cause much of a change in performance, is mostly likely to allow the coach to say, "I told you so,"
Mhm.
which I'm not sure is the best outcome. So.
Yeah, I think, one of the things you say, I think you got it from a rugby coach, but you say when you chase five rabbits, you catch none of them.
Yeah.
Unpacking that a little bit.
Yeah, maybe the single most useful piece of coaching advice. I it so it goes back to human working memory, which is the the part of our brains that thinks consciously, and this is kind of our human superpower, right? Uh, the zone press, the works of Shakespeare, mRNA vaccines, they're all the product of the incredible problem-solving capacity and higher order thinking capacity of human working memory. But human working memory is tiny, tiny, tiny.
Mm.
You can really think about one thing at a time. And I think it's a constant challenge for coaches, which is there's so much we want players to learn,
Yeah.
and we sometimes try and accelerate learning by telling them more things. So I often give this, and I'm going to speak the language of soccer because I don't really speak
Hey, please
basketball well
do.
enough to pull this off. But I give this example of like there's a coach, he's working on the idea of building out of the back with his players, which is and so he pauses them and he says, "Boys, when we're building out of the back, the ball has to be struck at pace on the ground, and we have to receive it with our back foot, with our eyes up, so we can spot gaps in the opposition defense, and we have to move the ball rapidly side to side to expose gaps in the opposition, and wing backs, I need you to press higher to put pressure on the opposition. Got it? Go. Right?
Ready.
Let's assume that all of that feedback is excellent.
Right.
It is excellent content for players to know. What is going to happen to a player next, right? There's no way a player can think about that many things. So the options are, well, the best case scenario is every player magically chooses the single most important thing for them to focus on, but you don't know which player is working on what, and which player is focusing on receiving with their back foot, and which player is focusing on the pace of their passes. So you can't say things like, yes, much better, Dustin, love the pace of that pass. And then, the next stoppage is going to be the same. And what's most likely to happen is most players will struggle to remember that much. They may remember none of it. It will probably degrade their performance, or else they'll have to learn to practice ignoring the coach because the coach has told them more things than they can process. And by the way, having your working memory overloaded is anxiety producing. Also, it's stressful, right? Oftentimes, like I'll get up on a Saturday morning and my wife will be like, I want you to do this and this and this. And I'm like, can we write this down somewhere? Because it's stressful to not be able to process everything that someone's telling you. And so it also has psychological effects. So I think, like the next stoppage in this practice that I'm describing is going to be the same 5 things, only shouted now because the coach is going to be frustrated because he's not seeing a change in behavior. So I think one of the hardest things in being a coach is to be disciplined about feedback and to maybe start with one piece of feedback. Boys, we need to focus on the speed of our passes when we're building out of the back. The ball needs to be struck at pace. Maybe I can add on the ground. Let me see that now. Go. Yes, James, much better pass. Strike it harder, Dustin, right? So now if I'm managing the one thing that we're all attentive to with our working memory, then I can also start to provide you feedback on how you're doing and sustain your focus and concentration on it. Yes, love to see those passes that way. And I just think that it's hard because we love the game and we know so much about it. We want to accelerate player learning by telling them one more thing and one more thing and one more thing. And it often has, ironically, the opposite effect, I think.
Yeah, and with that, like you're saying, the things that your wife gives you, if you don't remember those things, that halftime talk will not go well. Just so you know.
Right. I've had that halftime talk.
The coaching conversation that's one-sided. And with that, I
Yes.
think David Epstein has some great work in range about like habits that dance across disciplines. And he had something the other day I heard that he said breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. And I think you said this really well. I want to make sure to like thank the passer. I think you said as coaches at times we ask questions of our players because the game asks questions of them.
Hmm.
And if you don't give me the answers that my job became 10 times harder. Like the
Yeah.
ability of us working in concert with one another. There's a woman named Brittany Donaldson who was just on a great basketball pod where she said there's a difference between teaching the game and having knowledge of the game. In
Mm.
expert opinion, how do we as teachers get them with us on the same page as opposed to us just spewing random info over and over again?
Yeah. I was just reading a really interesting piece of research. It's done on students in the Czech Republic. And what they did was they studied the learning outcomes of groups of students based on on how often they spoke in class and how motivated they were.
Mhm.
And so one of the really interesting things about this study is they studied highly motivated students who never spoke in class.
Okay.
And what they found was that those students did not do as well as highly motivated students who did speak in class, and actually even as less motivated students who spoke in class regularly. Because some part of learning is having to process it and actively engage it. So, it's so important to ask players questions, right? Especially a group invasion game like basketball, where I have to read visual cues from the defense and interpret them faster, in a fraction of a second. And I can't rely on the coach to tell me. I have to learn to do it on my own. I have to learn to become an autonomous thinker. And to do that, I have to cause players to think constantly in practice.
Mm.
And that means sometimes changing their behaviors. I think both in terms of shaping what they're thinking about while they're playing, but also their ability to talk about and think about the game, and especially in a group game to be able to talk to each other, right? I hear all the time coaches saying to players, guys talk.
Right.
And I would say, one, unless we're practicing talking to each other productively in practice, it's probably not going to happen in the game. Two, one of the most powerful things that I can do is arm my players with shared vocabulary. If we use the same language with the same terms to describe what we're seeing, we see it the same way, then we can, and we have a shared model of what we're trying to accomplish, then our communication is likely to be, much more productive. So I love Brittany Donaldson's work, by the way, and so I think the idea of like the goal is to build autonomous learners, and I think some people interpret that as meaning that there's no such thing as knowledge, and I actually think it's, I don't think that's the case. I think background knowledge is really, really important.
Right.
That there are things that we can tell players, but we have to tell them and then allow them to use them and apply them and study and problem solve with those tools. So, yeah, I think the process of autonomy starts with knowledge. I think that some people find those two things contradictory, but
Yeah, yeah,
I
again, I
don't.
think, yeah, I think there's so much about, like, I think you hit it perfectly, that great cultures have great communication, but also great terminology. There are words
Yeah, yeah,
in this cohort that not everybody else uses, and that word should mean similar things to everybody. As opposed to get your eyes on the rim when you catch the ball, peak. That's the definition.
yeah, yeah. I love that, and I think that with cultures, sports. I mean, I think part of what's so fascinating about coaching sport is like a team is a culture. And we should think about it as that. And cultures have their own language and their own traditions and their own rituals. But a culture is almost always defined by its language. I
Mm.
think one of the most interesting interviews I did for the book was with Jesse Marsh, who's a very like highly regarded American soccer coach. And so much of his work is really just about vocabulary, about being able to name consistently the things that we want to do, both culturally, how we want to hustle, how we want to treat each other, and tactically. But one of the things that I think he does that's so smart about his vocabulary is he renames things. Like we might have there are a lot of common terms in soccer for like between the lines and I think he always tries to do two things with his vocabulary. To one, take something that if other people use the term outside of my club and outside of my team, they may use it differently than me, and I'm at risk of the term drifting in terms of its meaning. And so if I rename it and we're the only people who use that term and we have a discrete term, one, it's part of our culture, right? It reminds us that we're us, but it also means I have control over the term. And then the other thing is that he often tries to link the vocabulary to a story. And I think like stories are cognitively privileged is what a cognitive psychologist would say. Like, we evolved like most of the evolutionarily, most of the early learning we did was sitting around campfires telling each other stories, and the people who listened to those stories learned the aggregated cumulative information of people who'd gone before, and the people who didn't listen to those stories perished basically. So we've learned to really listen to and value stories. So he will often tell a story and then take a phrase from that story and name it, and that because so like one of his stories is about Roger Bannister and how people thought the 4 minute mile was an unbreakable barrier, and then he broke the barrier, and then within several years after him doing that, 5 or 6 guys did it. So he changed the perception of what people were capable of in terms of their physical endurance. So when he talks about giving the last drop of gas in your tank physically, he talks about that as like Roger Bannister moment. This is a Roger Bannister moment for us. So it's like discrete. It means something very particular in our culture, and it's connected to the story that helps you to kind of like remember it, which I think is vocabulary is very underestimated.
So good. Yeah.
Yeah, the power of stories is truly underrated, and just the sticky languages you can get in that, because we tell a lot of stories at our PGC
Yeah.
camps, and that's the things that the athletes most remember. So
Yeah.
as much as we can apply those. Next thing I got is effective feedback is just crucial for athletes improvement. Can you share any specific strategies coaches and players can like give each other that will
Yeah.
help motivate them and guide them towards development?
Yeah. Well, maybe first I'll just try to put a bow on two things that I think we talked about implicitly before, which is limiting the amount of feedback, right? Have to discipline the feedback environment, and then linking live feedback to stoppage feedback. Or, like so in before practice or during a stoppage in practice, I talk about the importance of defensive closeouts or defensive spacing, right? Then it's really important for me to show that I haven't forgotten that idea by giving you live feedback and telling you how you're doing, which both like allows you to be sort of self-reflective as a, metacognitive as a learner and self-regulate your learning, but also tells you that like we're not just talking here. Like after we when we talk about something tactically, I will be watching to see whether you do it. And so I think that's that like implicit loving accountability in that notion of like, I will tell you how, I will tell you one thing and then I will tell you how you're doing, I think is a really important, is an important piece of feedback. And then maybe also to tie in just the idea of vocabulary, which is, I want to make sure that when the terms I use when I give feedback, that my players understand it and can picture it, really well. But I was actually thinking of a story that this comes from one of my experiences in basketball. I was working with the head coach of an NBA team, and this is at summer league, and it's him and 5 or 6 other coaches, and a bunch of them are new, and so in the NBA, like the 10 guys on the floor, and there are maybe like 8 or 9 coaches. So every time someone touches the ball, someone, at least one person, possibly 2 or 3 people, is shouting something at them. And so from a head coach's perspective, this is problematic, right? Like I know that I need to not give you 5 rabbits to chase, but also like as a club, we can do that, right? There's so many people talking to players about different things at the same time. And so his challenge was to try to like discipline the feedback environment. And I think that one of the things I talk to a lot about, coaching groups that I work with, clubs and things like that, is one of the most important things in preparation for a session is to decide who's watching for what. That if we're all watching for everything, none of us are really watching in a disciplined way for anything, but we're also likely to give verbal feedback about everything. Whereas if we say, okay, you're watching for defensive closeouts, and you're watching for defensive spacing, and you're watching for speed of ball movement, now, one, I'm more likely to notice those things. And that's important for us to divide those responsibilities. But I'm also more likely to be disciplined about the feedback that I give. And then maybe if I go the next level of like, and I'm actually going to give you some place to write things down so that, like, I think one of the reasons why people often overload athletes with feedback is because they have a use it or lose it challenge, which is I'm watching you practice and I notice something. And my choice is either A, I can shout it at you in the moment that I notice it, or I cannot shout it. I cannot say something to you and risk that this never comes up in our conversation. I have to hope that I'll remember it later, which I probably won't. But if I have a place to write things down, now I have an option, which is I really can remember it later, and I can come back to it and say, yeah, during practice, I wanted to talk to you about your defensive closeouts. Right there, just like you need to get a little lower and be a little bit more decisive in your movement. So this is how this coach ended up disciplining the environment, was he gave all of his coaches some place to write things down so that they didn't always have to shout everything they were noticing to players in the moment. They could follow up with them later, which I think is fascinating. I'm sorry for like digression. Can I tell you one more like just really interesting story?
Please,
so
yes.
I spent a week with a rugby team, a national rugby team before the World Cup this summer, and they were trying to make a very small tactical change in players' behavior around the ruck in rugby. So the ruck is like ball player gets tackled, 2 players come by and sort of like form a little like huddle around the ball, and then you have possession of the ball. And so when you're defending so they were talking about defending the other opposition when they formed a ruck. And they wanted to be really aggressive and close the space on both sides of the ruck. So they wanted the players on either side of the ruck to like basically like take 3 or 4 steps forward very, very aggressively. Players in rugby are often aggressive on the strong side of the ball, but not on the weak side of the ruck. So this was like it's a very simple change. And all the players understood what the coach wanted them to do tactically. But then they went out. So first of all, they went out and they practiced. And at the end of the practice, the coach said, how did we do today about, being more aggressive on both sides of the ruck? And the assistant coach was like, pretty good. I think we did pretty well. And afterwards, we were just talking about the fact that like you're asking people to remember retrospectively what happened during the session. Really, they have no idea, right? Were they really watching in a disciplined fashion for what was happening around the ruck? You asked the coach who ran the session on defending the ruck whether he thought people got better. Of course, he said they got better. So the next day, we appointed one guy whose only job was to watch for whether we were, being more aggressive on both sides of the ruck. Mm-hmm. Again, this is an incredibly simple change that every rugby player knows how to do, but they walk out on the field and they revert to old habits, right? It's a habit change. Habits are incredibly hard to change. And it turns out that when they measured it, they were like being aggressive on both sides of the ruck about 20% of the time.
Okay.
So like it just wasn't, everyone intended to have, the players intended to change their behavior, but they couldn't. So the next thing that they were like, oh, so how do we start changing this very simple behavior? So the next day they went out and now that we have two guys whose only job is to watch for the ruck. And this to me was like the real breakthrough because the two guys held each other accountable. So they're standing on the sideline, and one guy is like, every time there's a ruck, his responsibility is to tell the other guy, strong side yes, weak side no, or both sides yes, or both sides no, and maybe even like name like this guy yes, this guy no. The second guy is writing it down and tabulating the data and radioing into the head coach, you got to pause him. We're not aggressive on both sides of the ruck. So like it's like 60% and then 80% day by day, like just by hammering it and being constantly looking for it and constantly focusing on the feedback, they ultimately, I think, were able to change this behavior. But it was very different, very difficult. Really, it took like two people. It was such a simple thing of just changing a simple behavior that everyone understood and wanted to change. But changing habits is really, really hard. And it took such discipline in feedback. And I think that there's something in that story, which is we assume that because people want to change their behavior, they just will. And I think we sometimes underestimate how much discipline, both in looking and in focusing on it in a training session, it requires to make even a very simple change like that.
Yeah, it seems like like one, there's alignment of language first that creates the
Yeah.
discipline of language. And then in basketball, our big phrase is discipline equals freedom. So it's like the
Yeah.
discipline of doing it over and over again will give you the freedom of whatever that is, working
I
memory.
love that. Yeah. I love that.
It's mine. I made it up. Thanks, Doug. Anyway.
I'm gonna quote you on that.
Yeah. But the other thing I had was you'd said a lot that games are won and lost in emotional regulation, the ability to
Yeah.
regulate in the storm, right? When things I'd found I
Yeah.
was a really young junior college head coach, and I'd found that in games I was much different than I was in training. So I'm
Mm.
very happy-go-lucky, very energetic. I think your energy introduces you before you speak, but then in games, I just was a different person. And there are times where a player would miss a layup, and I would yell at that player because I want everyone to know I taught that person better, right? I took
Yeah.
it personally. And then I had a guru coach. He was like my Yoda, but he had laminated on a piece of paper. And the feedback was, how will your reaction to this affect their long-term development as men? So just
Yeah.
kind of keeping in the stoic perspective. And so, like, do you mind unpacking where you see this may happen, where someone's different in a training environment than a game
Yeah.
environment? They're just a Jekyll and Hyde almost.
Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting because I actually had never, I mean, I had kind of an epiphany when you mentioned that, which is, um, of course, this happens to people all the time, right? You're probably more intentional about the person that you, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to be intentional about, this coach that I really admire talks about when he plans his training sessions, one of the things that when each activity he plans his emotional, what his, what his affect will be.
Mm,
Do I want to be super intense? Do I want to be relaxed and casual? Do I want to make guys feel loose and not worry about mistakes? Do I want them to be like incredibly like he's intentional about how he wants to present himself, which I think is very, I don't know that most coaches do that level of planning. He's a really insightful guy. But I hadn't this thought about like this gap has to, one of my favorite coaches, I think, is sort of similar to what you're describing. He's joyful and playful and funny and also very technical and precise in practice. And during games, he's very intense. And I think tends to narrate his anxiety back to players. I think what you said is really insightful, which is oftentimes what I hear players say on the side, what I hear coaches say on the sideline is designed to say, I taught them better, right? I taught them that they're not doing it. It's like a face saving kind of thing.
yeah.
So, we were talking about alignment of feedback before, right? The alignment of live feedback to stoppage feedback. I just think that like that kind of consistency and the connection of the different interactions, each interaction is not an independent variable. Each interaction is connected to other interactions, and that's how we build culture. This is a long-winded way of saying I hadn't really thought about the different in what it means to players that a totally different person with the same face and the same name emerges on game day and how that changes their experience and how that could like very easily feel like a betrayal, which is like you're loose with me and you tell me to have a great time and that we're a team and we're in this together, and then we walk out on the field and like it's all like it's all it's all different. And so I just think that's a really fascinating thing. It would be a great thing to ask someone to observe you for, which is like observe me in practice and observe me in the game and help me try to align those two people so that they're more consistent and predictable. Because I think as soon as it becomes unpredictable for players, then they have to use some of their working memory and some of their emotional regulation just to process their interactions with the coach. Whereas if it's predictable and they always know what they're going to get, then their minds can be elsewhere. I think about this a lot. I am sure that there are times when yelling at players is, like raising your voice with players is, I think it's part of coaching,
Mm.
probably, but I think it happens way too often. And I think coaches underestimate how much, as soon as you start shouting at a player, you're introducing a whole series of variables. Why is he yelling at me? Does he yell at everyone equally? Like, is he right to yell at me? Does he sound like my dad when he yells at me? My dad yells at me the same way. And all those things are distractions from the key point that you want players to think about, which is we need to be firing on both sides of the rock. Our defensive spacing needs to be better, right? So I'm often making it harder for players to hear my message by using emotion without real intention. And I think there are probably a few precise moments when a little bit of emotion is powerful, and then a lot of times when it's counterproductive.
It's almost like the message is lost in the form of which it's delivered, right?
Yeah, the medium is the message. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And I realize like players are playing three different games in every game. They're playing against the real game, they're playing against the coach now, and also playing against parents or fans. So it's like, how do you get their main focus on the game rather than bring attention to yourself as a coach? Let's change a little bit back to team dynamics and making things fun. I love how you said in practice perfect, like make it fun to practice. We talked to a Warriors coach recently about how they make practice fun for Steph and Clay. Like there's a reason why they're so successful, and because they focus on having fun. So what tools do you use or suggest for teams to do that in the middle of their
Yeah.
seasons?
Yeah, that's great. Well, you probably know more about this than me because, you know, I mean, I think this is your observation in the middle of the season. The season is long, right? Like I have a Premier League soccer club that I work with, and they like those guys play 10 or 11 months a year. Like they practice almost every day when they're not playing. It is a long, long season, and even if you love the game, like it must feel like a slog sometimes. I don't live that day to day, so you probably have some better ideas than me, and so you should tell me if you. But one of them that I just was talking about with a club was that um, so much of what they do is based on like building a culture of competition, right? We're always playing, we're always trying to play games, and we want players to compete fiercely and to love competition. And so they like one of their rules is we always keep score, right, in practice. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I don't even know how I feel about that, but that's one of the rules.
Yep.
And one of the things that struck me is that if I want to make, so like they'll be like in a typical activity, they'll be like 2 points if you score off a cross, and 1 point if or 3 points if you score this way.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting constraint, but it only works if guys really, really, really want those points, if they want to win, if they really care. So I have to sustain that culture of like desperately wanting to win every game and every practice for 11 months. It's a real challenge. So I was just brainstorming with them about like, how can you increase the stake? And I think playfulness and fun is a great way to increase the stake on the points, which is like, okay, after the game, when we win 8-6, because we really did, win on through balls, is there some sort of hilarious stick that we can be like the losers have to like sing, they have to run they have to run a lap singing some hilarious song, or do they have to does someone on the losing team have to bring in a really terrible baby picture of themselves? Do they, these might be terrible, but I think like that sense of like playfulness of like changing what's at stake is one way that I think you can create a culture that's fun and playful, but also competitive at the same time. But like I said, you probably have better. So I'd love to hear some of some of what you have done to make practices more enjoyable.
I go down the rabbit hole with this one, and I think like all great coaches, there's commonalities of like how they get the best of each other. There's one that Dean Smith had in North Carolina. It was called the 2-point rule, meaning he said not a bucket is scored without two people acknowledging the greatness of another. So the passer acknowledges the scorer acknowledges the passer. And so we'll do at our session, we have 200 athletes, and on a bucket, they have to acknowledge each other. And they're more cognizant of doing that, and the connection builds so quickly. And so the moment the ball goes through the net, you'll have 9 people that weren't even in the play pointing at each other because they don't want to get kicked off because they didn't. And so when parents see it, they start pointing as well. It's just a fun
Yeah.
way to like the bucket scoring when no one cares about that, everyone can get to group flow a lot easier.
Can I tell you, I love that. And can I tell you why I think that's the like science, the research behind why I think that's so important, which is there's actually a lot of research on happiness. There's this guy Seligman who's like one of the lead researchers on this, and he describes 3 different component factors of happiness, and they are pleasure, meaning, and community or connection.
Mm.
And I think that most people equate happiness with pleasure, which is like if we're gonna have fun, it needs to be like, well, happiness is fun, is fun or pleasure. But actually, the long-term research says that people are made are that happiness correlates most to a sense of meaning and a sense of belonging and connection and community. And so, what this Dean Smith exercise is doing is making people happy and enjoying themselves because they feel like they're indelibly connected to their teammates and their teammates appreciate them and they are meaningful and part of a community. And that it's actually those other two, meaning and community and connection, that are the greatest drivers of joy and happiness. So that's kind of how I would at least diagnose why that is such a powerful thing and so easily overlooked. Like I think classroom teachers will often try and make the classroom joyful by like, oh, we're gonna play Jeopardy today in the classroom. And that can be fun. Like I'm not saying don't do it, but like in some ways the dynamics of just like we love and appreciate each other together and we're actually doing math today, but we're laughing together doing the math and we are like showing our appreciation to each other and we feel connected to each other is at least as important to people feeling happy and enjoying, and loving what they do.
That's so well said. Yeah, gosh, that's awesome, man. I think it falls back too on like that hive mentality. Everyone wants to be part of the cognitive
Yeah.
group. They don't want to feel like an outlier and they feel connected through that. Man, Coach, thank you so much, man. We thoroughly enjoyed being able to steal like an artist and obviously acknowledge all that you've done for the game. Where can people follow you and stay in touch with you and follow on your journey?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So I have a blog. It's teachlikechampion.org/blog. I try and write about teaching and coaching there and post videos and things like that. And I'm on Twitter at Doug _Lemov, so you can follow me there also. And then the books are available at your local bookseller or or online. And again, I really appreciate having the chance to chat with you guys. It was really fun.
Yeah, and again, we said this before we started, but we get a lot of coaches, high school coaches and teachers that come to our sessions, and this is definitely the book that is given a lot, as well as Practice Perfect and Teach Like a Champion. And we just want to take a moment to say thanks again. We really appreciate you taking the time, Coach.
Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate you, Coach. And let's hop on another time, and would love to keep learning from you.
Yeah, that'd be great.